My story starts as a teacher in the early 2000s. Specifically, 2006, this education policy document called 21st Century Skills came out, which later became part of the Common Core state standards. And one of the things that this document said is that one of the essential skills that students needed to develop and that schools needed to develop in them for the modern workplace was creativity. Now that intent is actually fabulous. Indeed, creativity is a necessary skill in the modern workplace, in all fields. It's how people innovate, how they problem solve. But I imagine that the conversation went a little something like this. Policymakers, teachers, you must teach creativity. Teachers, gee, we don't know how to do that. Education leaders, can you tell us how to do that? Education leaders, well, give us a little time to think about that, but you have an art teacher in your building. They're creative. I bet they can show you how to teach creativity. And overnight, me and every other art teacher became a rock star. We became the most important person in our building because somehow we had the silver bullet to address this new mandate of teaching creativity. Well, we weren't really ready for that. And part of the reason we weren't ready for that is all those people looking to us for insight, they didn't agree on what creativity was. They all had different definitions. And a lot of them didn't even think creativity could be taught. They thought, maybe it's something we can foster. We'll till the soil and it'll grow naturally. So this was something that really interested me to understand this phenomenon. And I started my master's degree in art education in 2008. And I wanted to research it more. And I did the research and I discovered that there's this wonderful body, a huge body of quality scholarship, 50 years worth of work on creativity. But all the folks in the education space, in the K-12 education space over here, they weren't really looking at that body of research. There's a disconnect. And even more concerning, a lot of the things that educators, as well as the general public, seem to believe and understand and assume about creativity weren't actually accurate when you looked at the research. Let me give you some examples because some of you might actually hold some of these misperceptions yourself. One of those is that creativity is a gift, something that's rare, maybe even tied to mental illness or neurodiversity. Nothing could be further from the truth. Creativity is a universal human trait exhibited by all humans. A lot of people in the education space said, you know what, we can't teach creativity because schools rely on extrinsic motivation, on external reward systems. And those environments discourage creativity, squash creativity. Well, actually the research says that's not universally true. It's not automatic that an external reward or external motivation would discourage creativity. Some folks in the education space said, oh, this is easy. All teachers value creativity. They value creativity in their students. They already do this. Well, the research showed that their espoused beliefs, every teacher said they valued creativity, but when researchers studied their classroom instructional practices, in fact, their practices did the opposite and discouraged creativity. And some folks over in the education space said, you know what? There's a problem here because many children at different developmental levels, they lose creativity. They're not as creative at some points in their development. Well, the research said, no, actually that's not true either. There are no developmental changes, it's all socialization. And in fact, some of your observations of students' behavior and defining as creative or not may be vulnerable to biases about gender and race and culture. So all these folks over here had some concerns. Their last concern was structure, right? Our schools are very structured environments, and structure is incompatible with creativity. Again, the research said the exact opposite. In fact, structured environments greatly foster creativity. And we know this to be true if you think very carefully about some of the greatest exhibitions of creativity come from people who had the least amount of resources and had to do what they could with them at the time. So, what the heck then is creativity? That's the question. The most universally accepted definition of creativity from the researchers are things, ideas, or concepts that are both unique, original, novel, and valuable, appropriate, or useful. Takes both halves of the definition. Something that appears creative, but is completed through or following a rigid set of steps, is not creativity. A truly unique, original idea that has no usefulness in context, that's also not creativity. And that definition is pretty simple till you start unpacking it. Novel to whom? Useful to whom? Novel to all of humanity throughout all history? Useful to all of humanity? And here's where the disconnect came, why all this great body of research wasn't being used by educators. Because all that research had been about adults and professionals and titans of various fields. And that's exceptional examples of creativity, or what researchers started calling big C creativity. What we were actually talking about with students was little c creativity, and what happened in our classrooms. If that is novel and original to that student in that classroom, and useful and appropriate for the task at hand in that school, in that classroom, then absolutely, that kindergarten class is full of creativity. So when you consider that context and start redefining what is useful, what is novel, then it becomes obvious how we can develop and teach creativity in our schools. So I would love to share with you 4 research-based best practices that can actually teach creativity in you, in the young people in your life, in the adults around you, in anyone. Number 1, metacognition, or thinking about your thinking. Being reflective, considering your problem-solving process, your thinking process. It only gets better if you consider it, reflect on it, and refine it. So model that for the young people in your life. Give them space to do that. But the research shows us that metacognition is one of the biggest keys to being more creative. Number 2, create environments that encourage and reward creativity. Young people need to explore, experiment, wonder, express, discover. All those things. Or at the very least, ensure that the environment you've created doesn't discourage creative behaviors and creative thinking. And it's okay to reward creativity. Again, it does not demotivate students to be creative, to expressly request, encourage, and reward when students and young people engage in those behaviors and ways of thinking. Number 3, and this is the boring one, observation. Creativity has to start with careful observation of the world around you. It's the only way that you can then understand what is novel and original, understand what would be useful and appropriate. And this is where I think there's a kernel of truth of how the visual arts were the place where creativity was being developed, because the visual arts are very intentional about teaching observational skills. The only way you get to recreate the visual world is by careful observation of the visual world. Other place in schools that we do teach observation skills is in our science classes, when students observe phenomenon to gather data, engage in experimentation. Outside of those two places, we're not really good at encouraging and having students actually develop observation skills. All right, number 4. I saved the hardest for last. But this is what research tells us is the greatest key to being more creative. Tolerance for ambiguity, incongruity, uncertainty, unfinishedness. And this is hard because for most adults and young people, this takes you out of your comfort zone. Of course, we don't grow while we stay in our comfort zone, right? So I want everyone to reflect on, how do you make space in your life for those things, for ambiguity, incongruity? How do you develop a way to coexist with paradox that we all live in? Unfinishedness. How do you make those spaces? How do you encourage the young people you work with to make space for those experiences? I challenge all of you to make more space every single day. How much time do you spend contemplating deep questions? Philosophy, religion, the meaning of the universe, whatever it may be, those questions that are frankly unanswerable. That can prep your mind to explore those ideas. Riddles. How much time do you spend solving and thinking about riddles, especially the ones that have multiple possible answers? Both and thinking instead of either or thinking. How many times can you stop yourself and think, have I locked myself into either or thinking on this problem when the answer is both and? And how much room is there in your life for spontaneity and healthy impulsiveness? How much balance is there between routine and following an instinct or pursuing a new idea? This is the bread and butter. These are the things that if you model for students and give them the space to do, you will teach children to be more creative. Thank you.